Good afternoon, everyone. Everyone who's attending from all parts of the world. Hopefully it's afternoon or good morning or good evening to you all. And welcome to our virtual Fireside chat, which is actually sponsored by CloudExpo Asia. Organized by CloudExpo Asia and sponsored by BMC. So the topic is around powering DataOps of automation. You can see here we've got a number of guest speakers with us today, and hopefully they're not new to some of you. And we will have a good conversation around DataOps. So maybe a quick one on the navigation for everyone who's attending. On the right-hand side, there'll be a couple of tabs around handouts. So in the meantime, there are a couple of brochures and white papers that you can download and read at your own time. There is another button for polls. So along the way, we will be submitting a couple of polls and get some feedback from the audience and have a discussion around that. And then finally, there should be a Q&A tab for you as well. So as we go along, as you have any questions, feel free to put it into the Q&A, and we will answer that as we speak, or maybe at the end of the session, we will bring that up and hopefully we'll answer your questions. And if we don't manage to answer everything in the hour that we have, we will reply back to you via email as well afterwards. Okay. So without further ado, quick introduction on the people you see on your screen now. Maybe I'll start with myself since I'm talking first. My name is Ronald. I am a managing director in PwC Singapore within our risk assurance practice. So I've been working in data and analytics for about 17 years now, 15 of those years in consulting, 2 of those years in banking and insurance. So within Asia, about 11 years, or most of that time within Singapore. So not new to a lot of clients within Asia and across APAC as well. I specialize in data management and data governance, helping clients from strategy and design, target operating models, frameworks, all the way through to technical implementation and also operationalization. So next up, I will introduce Guy Eden. So Guy Eden heads up the product management team at BMC's Digital Business Automation Division. He is responsible for the market-leading Control M framework orchestration platform. Guy has been with BMC for more than 3.5 years, and he was responsible for the launch of BMC's Helix Control M product. Prior to BMC, I think Guy spent a number of years in fintech in multiple roles, including the head of product management in the London Stock Exchange. He was responsible for the Una Vista reporting, which is around trade matching and data services. So he's also held multiple roles within SunGard's financial messaging system. Much earlier, I think Guy has been building automation systems for warehouses and production lines, even before or even earlier in an experimental particle physicist. Okay, that's a mouthful as well, specializing in using large simulated data sets to predict experimental outcomes. So I think he likes to claim he did fintech before it was actually known as fintech. Industry 3.0 before there was Industry 4.0. I think he's been coining some of these terms before we heard about it, and also big data before it's called big data. So he is maybe a little bit older than he looks. Okay, next on the list would be Dr. David Hardoon. So Dr. David Hardoon, a number of roles across the region. Chief Data, currently he's the Chief Data and AI Officer at the Union Bank of Philippines, CDO at Union Digital, Chief Data and Innovation Officer at Aboitiz Group, and also MD at Aboitiz Data Innovation. That's a lot of roles David is currently holding. And on top of that, there's a few more. David is also an external advisor in Singapore's Corrupt Investigation Practices Bureau, and also a senior advisor there around the AI topic, and also in Singapore's Central Provident Fund, so CPF, also in the capacity of a senior advisor. Prior to that, David has been in Singapore for a while as well, working with MAS as the first appointed Chief Data Officer and also the Head of Data Analytics, reporting to the Deputy Managing Director for Financial Supervision. And subsequently was also a Special Advisor in AI, reporting to the Deputy MD for Markets and Development. So in these roles, I think David has been responsible for the development of AI strategy for both MAS and Singapore's FS sector as well. So David, obviously, is a doctor. He does hold a PhD in computer science in the field of machine learning, from the University of Southampton and Royal Holloway. Okay, moving on, we have Juan Kangrawan. Juan is currently the head of data analytics at Jakarta Smart City. Key role is utilizing data to formulate public policy, improving quality of public services. Juan is actively planning, building, and delivering digital and data portfolios. He's actively analyzing complex and diverse urban data on a daily basis, whether it's citizen complaint or aspirations to transportation, mobility, health around COVID-19, flooding, CCTV, etc. I think in order to build an exciting and innovative digital ecosystem in Jakarta, he's also helping develop and align strategic partnerships between Jakarta Smart City and with other government agencies, business enterprises, research, and universities. Last but not least, we have Harwinder Rekhi. Harwinder is currently an ED in the Group Tech and Operations at United Overseas Bank. He leads the strategy, roadmap, and delivery of the bank's core functional services like enterprise monitoring and observability, site reliability engineering, capacity management, workflow automation, and IT asset management. Prior to UOB, Harwinder spent about 13 years in JP Morgan, leading a range of senior technology positions in infra across engineering and operations, in cloud and virtualization. Harwinder is passionate about technology and likes to spend his spare time in innovations like crypto and blockchain. Hopefully he's still doing well after the weekend. And he currently is in Singapore with his wife and his 2 children. Okay, that was an introduction to the 5 of us that you see now. So jumping right into it, maybe Guy, if I can pass it to you to kind of maybe help us explain, DataOps as a topic. Obviously, it means many different things to different people. So I think it'll be good to set that context so that we're all, the audience is aware of what we are going to discuss moving forward. Guy, over to you.
Absolutely. Thanks very much, Ronald. Hello, everybody. Great to be here, even if only virtually. So, DataOps. It's an obvious truism that all big firms are increasingly reliant today on the insights that can be gained from applying big data and machine learning techniques. And that means it becomes increasingly critical to everybody's business that the data involved, both at source and in aggregate, can be efficiently managed and insights efficiently gained. So DataOps is a fashionable term that covers a lot of aspects of how we do that. At its core, in my view, is the application of DevOps-style techniques and agile software engineering approaches to the management of that data. Obviously, with the ultimate aim of unlocking actionable insights from the data and getting some real business value out of it. And I think, like in DevOps, it falls really into 2 main areas. A lot of it is about process, and no less, a lot of it is about culture. When we talk about process in DataOps, the crux of it is really how to operationalize the production deliverables. There are a lot of test and training workflows involved when we analyze our data, but the core here is ensuring that those test and training workflows are ready to be taken into a business critical production workflow, and that process can be done in a repeatable way. Ultimately, that has to allow the organization to predict, adjust, and respond to what's happening in the business, the industry, the market, and the world. So that repeatability has to be consistent and it has to be timely. So that repeatable process is one part of it. The other part, of course, is cultural. Just as in DevOps, DataOps brings together maybe an even broader range of people, because you need your DevOps teams in there, data engineers, data architects, data scientists, analysts, application developers, IT operations. So there's a large range of personas that need to be brought together and that need to work together to ensure these repeatable processes occur properly and that the data is collected and analyzed and used at the right time in the right place. And there's a whole bunch of principles we can talk about around this. The most interesting one to us at BMC is, of course, orchestration. And some would argue that is the most important aspect of making sure these workflows in production run in a repeatable and consistent way. So the ability to orchestrate the huge range of different tools that exist in the DataOps space, the code required around those, the different environments is key. And being able to orchestrate workflows and take them from test and into production across the multiple functions in the organization, across different silos, across teams who might have chosen different tool sets, that's the way that you get the most efficient insights out of your DataOps process. There are a number of other important things as well. One is reproducibility. This, in the end, is an analytical process. Obviously, if we put the same data in, we expect to get the same results out. So there needs to be an element of, call it scientific reproducibility and repeatability in all of these things. And because we have large data sets and disparate tool sets, that's not necessarily trivial. And that goes back to automation orchestration again. There are a few other things that people also say are very, very important here. One, for example, is disposable environments, the ability to spin up and spin down environments very quickly so you can rapidly experiment. But once again, take those easily into production is important. Quality, governance, compliance around your data sets, absolutely critical as well. And the ability to monitor and measure that data to weed out anomalies and inconsistencies is also really important. And finally, being sure that the analytics you're producing are absolutely of value, because we can create a lot of analytics out of large sets of data, but making sure they're of value to the business is also another one that's really, really important. So I think if we go back, process and culture, as ever, are critical. So the process of DevOps is all about productionizing what you've done in test and training. The culture is about bringing together all those different people and different teams. And that ties together with orchestration, which is what actually helps you make all of this a repeatable process and derive your analytics in a timely and safe way. So I think really, apart from the obvious metrics of having those insightful analytics, I think part of the success really arises when your end-to-end data pipeline is intimately associated in everybody's minds with the business process that you're ultimately providing insights for. That's one of the potential cultural measures of success as well. So I think that's a summary of where we see DataOps today.
Okay, great. Thanks, Guy. Thanks for the introduction and the awareness around the different parts of DataOps. It's not a technology play, standalone. Obviously, there's a lot more around process, culture, people. So that kind of brings us to maybe our first topic around the challenges of DataOps, right? So DataOps is not new. I wouldn't say it's old either. Fairly recently, companies are starting to embark on the DataOps process and trying to implement it. So starting with the challenges and maybe Juan, if I can call you out first of all, coming from a governance perspective, around bureaucracy or policy, etc. What are some of the challenges that you face with trying to bring DataOps into Jakarta?
Okay, sure. Thank you for the question. And I think in terms of the challenge, I will speak representing the government or the public sector context. So I will share a bit, and in general, not only about DataOps. I think in terms of technology in general, there are three key areas in terms of challenges. The first one is the structure. The second one is culture. The third one is technical. I will mention briefly, and after that, I will share the relation with DataOps. So first one, the structure, I think in the first place is about the identity and then the purpose of data team, about the reporting line, and then the drive and authority. Are we able, let's say, to ask other people to share the data to us? Are we able to double check the quality of the metrics or the performance, for example? For the culture, I think it's the openness about the use of data to bring value, as simple as develop a dashboard, report, and make decisions based on data. To be open, in Jakarta, we have 200 to 300 government agencies, and not all of them, they are that open in using data, not saying even DataOps. So I think that's the second challenge. The third one is about technical. So it's about the process, the quality check, the way we implement tools, and so on. So now when I talk about DataOps, I think the keyword to me personally is about process and habits. So before I joined in Jakarta Smart City, I think there is no such iterative approach. There is no such agile methodology implemented. Typical government, Indonesia, both in province and also national level, we only check our targets somewhere around September, December for annual target. I think that's not a good practice. So for me, I start simple. We implement the weekly focus, the weekly sprint, and I want to have a daily stand-up with my team, 20, 30 of them. So we want to ensure there is progress, there's incremental efforts that we have been doing so far. Now, talking about DataOps, I think the key point here is how we can ensure we build something in the iterative approach, and we can ensure there's a quality check. We can always start with data team within our data engineering, data scientists, data analytics, and so on. And there is so-called semi-automated checking in terms of the quality, can be about pipeline, can be about dashboard, can be about analytics, can be about data model, and so on, and how we can involve the stakeholders as well in terms of the acceptance of the quality check. So I think, in short, those are the areas. The challenges are still there to be open. The 3 parts that I mentioned in the beginning, which is the structural, cultural, and technical. But yeah, we are progressively increasing and improving. So I can elaborate more in our further discussion. Thank you.
Thanks, John. And maybe David, I'm going to call you out next. You mentioned earlier chat around how do people shift from aspiration to actuality. So really, realistically, what can actually be achieved versus what are the real gaps at the organization. So from your experience in your company and your bank now, what are some of the challenges that you're seeing?
Well, first and foremost, thanks for having me here. I think one of the key and main challenges is realizing it's a challenge. And I know it may sound a bit kind of parabolical, but it's actually a very important one. That talking about DataOps or DevSecOps to a certain extent is significantly easier than from an execution perspective. And if you're coming obviously from a data science and AI world, incorporating this fluidity, which is essentially data science and AI, with kind of that richness and specificity of DevSecOps, it takes quite a bit of time. So the first and most important challenge is realizing it's not like, okay, we just want to do it and, Bob's your uncle, if I use that analogy. The second one is, as I was kind of alluding to, is the duality of, on the one hand, if you think about the nature of, again, going beyond the traditional building your various ETL or ELT jobs, but really more from a data science, AI, machine learning type of approach. We all know it's a relatively exploratory-based approach. There's that fluidity that I was referring to earlier in terms of what is the right model, how do we fine-tune, which is the attributes associated. There's a lot of backwards and forwards. So what's been really critical, and actually one of the things that we've done, is what I called establishing, and again, throwing a bit terminologies out there, but anyone can call whatever they want, an AI factory. Coming up with really a very set of concrete steps in terms of a handover from one step to the other, essentially, which each one of them can be confined and, most importantly, replicated. Now, why I'm highlighting that point, because one of the realizations I think that many organizations would have going down this path have realized that, you do all this investment, and then suddenly when you want to do something else, you have to do all that investment again. So it's critically important in establishing that framework whereby it's replicable to a certain extent, regardless on the application, whether it's your front office, your back office, your middle office, risk, marketing. These are fundamentally the things that are necessary from inception all the way to productionalization. However, at the same time, allowing for leniency in within these steps to allow for that flexibility and fluidity that I was referring to, that portion may slightly, or in a certain extent, even significantly differ depending on the context and the domain in which it's been applied in. So if you notice here, it's really kind of marrying of these two perspectives, but that's a challenge. However, doing that, putting in place those underlying frameworks, pulling it out, experimenting, allows for the replicability that is extremely necessary, getting essentially the ability to now scaling it out across an organization. So those are some of both the key challenges as well as some of the approaches towards addressing them.
Okay, great. Thanks, David. And then maybe time for a quick poll, and maybe in parallel, Harwinder, I'll probably call you out next. I want to start one poll now, and hopefully everyone can see it. So the first poll we wanted to kind of run is around the platform your data pipelines are running, and obviously for the audience, I think depending on the size and scale of your company, whether you've been established for 100 years or you're a new startup, I think that answer would probably shift. I would assume a lot of people are probably on hybrid modes at the moment. On-prem, I would say a bit more traditional, slowly moving away from that. So maybe Harwinder, as people are answering, and I can see a lot of either on-prem or hybrid cloud at the moment. From UOB's perspective, any maybe two questions. One is what is your cloud strategy, and maybe how do you bring that cloud strategy and kind of integrate that with the DataOps kind of as a topic, and what are the challenges that you're kind of facing as well around that?
Sure. Thanks a lot, Ronald, and thanks for having me here. I think cloud is one thing which has become a necessity, really, and we are definitely looking at cloud as a strategic technology in many of our solutions and services. From a strategy perspective, I think like many of the other financial institutions, we are also looking at a hybrid cloud strategy. Obviously, for some of the workloads that make sense to run on-prem, and now we are looking at extending that to leverage or build on some of the other use cases, and we are working with multiple cloud partners to see what we can do with these public cloud technology providers for some of the use cases. Specifically, I think to run our data intensive workloads, specifically around AI or ML, especially in the areas of risk and fraud detection, etc. So I think there's a lot of exciting work going on there, not just to enable our core business processes as well, but also to drive some of our IT operations workloads as well. I think we're looking at a combination of a hybrid and multi-vendor cloud strategy.
Okay, great. Thanks, Avinda. And Joanne, maybe I'll pass it to you as well. I think, as you can see from the results, and I guess it's a good point also around, the location, regulatory, etc. What's that cloud, from regulators' perspective, Joanne, in Indonesia and in Jakarta, what are you seeing in terms of people moving to the cloud? Are they still reluctant? And how does that integrate with the DataOps pipeline? Because obviously with cloud, it's easier to spin up, spin down, CI/CD, a lot more tools that are readily and easily fastly available as well, right? So any views around that?
Sure, thanks for the question. And I think it's a very interesting topic about cloud implementation, especially in the government, not only Indonesia, but also ASEAN in general. I have paradoxical points here. The first one, personally, as a professional, I want to implement cloud as much as possible. It is more scalable and so on. At the same time, as a government, there are really strict policy on that. I think the situation can be different in ASEAN countries, let's say in Singapore, Malaysia, Thailand, and so on. But again, in general, I think for government, we are a bit more careful in using cloud. I'm not saying we don't use at all, but we must be careful what kind of data, applications, processes that we need to put there. So for me, it's quite straightforward. I need cloud to make it more scalable, services, data science, machine learning, and so on. At the same time, I need to be careful what kind of data, critical operation that I need to put there. So to present internally to our governor, head of agency, and so on, I need to clearly state to them what is the coverage of cloud, what are the applications, the criticality, and why we can do that at this point, and how we want to move forward in a scalable manner. To be open, we are not that great if you compare to the technology companies or the let's say MNCs. So we are still using quite a number of on-premise solutions, let's say 50-60%, but hopefully in the future, we can move more and more to clouds, and especially some of the major cloud providers, they establish the data center also operations in Indonesia. I think it's a wonderful direction. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, John. And I see, people are coming over with some Q&A, and I appreciate you guys are, paying attention and asking the questions as well. So on that, and maybe Guy, let's answer one of them first. We've got 3 upvotes on the first one. So the question is around, there are a lot of major vendors that, we did as part of the polling. All of them provide quite a broad range of data management services and capabilities. So in terms of the application workflow automation, when we run that in cloud, how does that kind of work in a multi-cloud environment? How do we synchronize and make sure it's running autonomously?
Sure. So first thing to say is exactly when you have multi-cloud, that's really when you need some sort of umbrella framework which will allow you to automate your process across those different clouds. So if you're running a small experiment in AWS, well, you've got plenty of tools there that will help you orchestrate that. If you've got some running in AWS and something else running in Azure, that becomes a little bit more complicated. And then it's absolutely necessary to have some sort of framework which is independent of the cloud vendors, which enables you to orchestrate across those. And in fact, we have examples amongst some of our customers who've actually decided to move across different cloud vendors. We have a customer from way back who started on the mainframe. Nobody thought I would say that in this conversation, but they had lots of analytics running on the mainframe way back when. As they realized they had to improve their technology, They began to implement big data techniques. And they decided to do that in one of the major cloud vendors using what was then Cloudera. They then realized that that cloud vendor was too expensive for them, and they needed to move to another cloud vendor using, it was actually AWS in the end, and they used EMR. But they ended up in a situation where they have these different technologies, different cloud vendors, and elements of what they need to do in production with appropriate governance and SLAs need to keep running. So that's exactly where the power of a broader workflow automation framework comes into play, because you can manage all these different processes across the different cloud vendors independently of what you're doing, and make sure that you'll still have all the governance and compliance and SLA management that you need. And where you need to shift processes from Azure to AWS or AWS to GCP and make sure they're still running in production, these kind of frameworks are precisely what enable you to do that while still meeting any SLAs and governance and compliance rules that you have.
Okay, thanks, Guy, and hopefully, Naf, that answered your question. If not, please post it back in the Q&A if you have any follow-on to that. So maybe moving on to the next broader topic of adoption. So again, DataOps as a topic with the process, the people side, the tech side. Maybe David, if I can call you out now. From a union bank perspective, or your friends, etc., in your network, how has the adoption rate of DataOps been for your understanding?
Well, for us, it's been an absolute must, especially given the last 2 years of the pandemic and the massive shift to remote servicing of consumers and as well as corporations to a certain extent. And obviously, if you take the context of the Philippines, it's not possible to meet the scalability that's needed without that flexibility of DataOps. So the answer is absolutely and extensively. To such an extent where, our CEO has spoken this in quite a number of times, our goal is actually by the end of this year is to be entirely cloud-based, including core banking systems, to fully leverage on the competencies and capabilities of DataOps. So this is important. It's not a question of if. I think it's more of a question of accepting the truth of the matter and seeing how best to do it in a way that provides that scalability and flexibility to an organization. Now, again, it's a journey. I'll be the last one to say that it's not. And also there's if we are frank, a degree of pain associated, but the end conclusion is foregone. I mean, it's absolutely clear. It's just a matter of how do we get there in a way that's most effective to us as an institution, an organization, and obviously to the consumers that are being served.
Yeah. Okay. Great. No, thanks, Dave, for sharing. Yeah, and I agree. With COVID, everyone working from home. Automation, access, the need for more data, I think, and the need of capturing more and more data, right? Everything's being virtualized, everything's being digitized. So I think as we capture more and more data, I think the automation aspect becomes more and more important. And maybe just bringing that same question to Harwinder, if I can call you out as well to share a bit around, what UOB is doing around, adoption of, DataOps as a topic, or, any of the new AI technologies. And, has COVID also impacted you guys too?
No, absolutely. And maybe I'll touch upon AIOps and as an area because I'm probably more closer to that. Again, I mean, I consider that as a subset of DataOps. And I think back to David's point, I think the innovations that are happening in the financial services, I think these are unprecedented, right? And thanks to the pandemic, I think some of the acceleration that we have seen in the digital adoption, it's just phenomenal, right? And I think from an IT operations side, it becomes very, very critical as to when we are rolling out these new services, new platforms, how do we monitor the health, the performance, the availability, and the capacity? Because the customer behavior, it's very, very difficult to predict in these times. And I think having a good sense on these systems, and again, through all the IT ops data that is coming on from your systems, from the endpoints, from the ATMs, I think getting that all together into one common repository and start making some sense out of it. I think that's a journey we have been in the past couple of years. And again, I would say it's a journey. It's not an end state, and working very, very closely with, I think, some of the vendor partners to see how we can go about it. And again, I think the journey has been very, very challenging, right? I think even explaining what we're trying to do sometimes becomes very, very difficult. So we have been keeping it, as I like to call it, the KISS principle. Keep it simple and stupid, so that you're not trying to boil the ocean. Start with something which is maybe very, very easy to solve for. And to give you an example, I think one of the issues that we were trying to solve for is basically all this payments, the monitoring of the payments, right? And considering the banking, you can think about due to the pandemic, I think that the kind of payments, the shift that we were seeing from in the payments was very, very phenomenal. And I think in the payments world gets very, very complex, because depending upon the country, depending upon whether it's a like payment or an unlike payment, or high value, low value. So I think the space was very, very complex. So we thought of going after a very, very specific use case. And that kind of gave us the focus to understand what are the systems that we need to get the data from, at what frequency, whether it is real time or batch. And that kind of led the strategy to basically build what we call a data warehouse or a data lake, where we can pull all the real-time data and start putting some analytics out of it, and getting, I think, making some good sense. I mean, are the payments being processed? Are there is a risk of getting some kind of a cutoff, and so on and so forth. I think we're still on that journey. I wouldn't say we are still building those capabilities, but I think some of the results that we are seeing are very, 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 very exciting, and we would like to continue to be on the journey.
Okay, great. Thanks, Awinder. Let me open up another poll as we continue to speak. I'm going to start one now around the SLA for service delivery. Because as we talk about, automation, etc., obviously in a more traditional environment, a lot of things are done manually, and they can be skipped and they can be missed. And timelines can be delayed, etc. And so, how often are your SLAs for service delivery being missed? Right, and that kind of impacts how much automation we should be putting in there, and how much of that we need to actually manage. Now, while people are answering that, and maybe Joanne, I'm going to throw a question at you. The next one from Mansil. So, how do we ensure that the steps in data and analytics can be replicated or reproduced? So I think it was a good point. As I think, as we all know, that there's a lot of turnover, I'm sure, with all of our teams, people getting new jobs, etc. So how do you retain that knowledge, right? As someone does the data prep, the analysis, the production, and also the consumption side of that analytics, that end-to-end pipeline, how do we retain that knowledge and explain that to the next person that's coming in, etc.?
Okay, sure. Thank you for the question. And in my personal opinion, I think the topic is quite huge, and I hope I can interpret the question correctly. So I'll try to tackle firstly from the process perspective or methodology. The second one is more on the knowledge repository. I will share what I mean by that. So the first one, in terms of the process. So before I join and lead the data analytics at Jakarta Smart City, I think there is no such process. Let's say how to deploy a model, how to build a pipeline, how to generate insights, and so on. So after I joined, the really first step that I want to establish first, what is the key objective and how to reach that objective by certain systematic steps or processes. For example, for insight, we need to define the business questions, hypothesis, and then exploratory data analysis, and then in-depth analysis, presentation, and so on. For pipeline, how you can ensure there is certain assessment, change management, impact analysis, and so on. So I think I built and I proposed this process, not necessarily by using a tools first. Sometimes can be just a habits behavior change. I think sufficient. But moving forward, try to implement some tools, for example, like Git, for example, or certain automation in publishing our dashboard, digital products, and so on. I think by having this process, it's really useful, I can tell, because for the new joiners, for example, in my team, data scientists, engineers, analysts, product, and so on. So they can understand the expectation and then the process, the standard, and they can follow. So I think it's really helpful. Even in government context, not many teams have such process and standard. That's the first one. But secondly, if we talk more about knowledge repository and then about the knowledge understanding, I think the process is not enough for sure. We need to build, I call it a narrative. I mean, I learned from Amazon for this one, and also how we can ensure that this kind of fundamental knowledge can be shared, not only within data team, even not only Smart City, but even to the decision makers in the government in Jakarta, can be governor, the government team, head of agencies, and so on. So I think that is the habits that I want to start and also improve. So we have this kind of at least monthly sharing about the practice, the knowledge, and I encourage my team to share as well. At the same time, I want this kind of knowledge repository to be accumulated semi-automatically. It means it's not only me who built this kind of knowledge repository. It can be my team members. It can be other smart city division, for example, like communication and also like the IT development and so on. So in this context, how we can ensure the so-called DataOps and also the knowledge sharing can be done across division, across team will be highly critical. So I hope I understand the question correctly. So that's my point or my answer from the first from the process perspective, and second from the knowledge repository. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, John. I think it's never an easy topic around knowledge retention, right? Because I think if we got it right, we can't have a Wikipedia page, for every organization. Everyone's starting that, how we can retain the best we can. Knowledge exchange and collaboration, I think, is another key thing around the organizations now. How do we collaborate better? But yeah, it's always going to be a journey. So back on the polling, looks like we've got couple of our answers coming back. So Guy, I'm going to call you out on this one. So, around the SLA for service delivery, I see we have, 29% on don't know. Hopefully that's a good thing. Either your pipelines are working great or your tech team is fixing it very quickly. So you actually don't know and you're getting the data information that you need. So that's a good sign. Rarely, obviously, is good 1 to 2 times a month or 3 or more times. Okay, that's not a good thing. Guy, maybe from your perspective, how does tools and technology kind of minimize or improve on SLAs and make sure, how do we recover faster even if something breaks?
Sure. So first of all, the first sort of trivial answer is that your tooling should enable you to measure those SLAs, right? So if you don't know how often you're missing those SLAs, that's already an issue, and you need to have some sort of tool set in place to enable that. And as ever, the overriding theme from our point of view is that if you have the right orchestration tool, that should be measuring those end-to-end SLAs, even when you change the process in the middle. So even if you chop and change components, if you're changing tool sets, the SLA management piece needs to be something that is uniform and consistent, so that as you move forward, as you change technologies, you're still able to measure, the fact that you are or are not meeting those SLAs. You need the right monitoring tools in place in order to give alerts if you're likely to miss those SLAs. So this is really critical, right? And in general, DataOps needs to move fast because there's nothing worse than poor quality data that's delivered too late to meet business needs. So it's first and foremost to make sure you have that tool set in place and making sure, again, that tool set is consistent irrespective of changes in underlying components to be able to measure that SLA. What can you do if you miss it? Well, again, remediation means first and foremost alerting. So the earlier you can alert on problems in the process, the better. Nowadays, we're seeing increasing usage of techniques like, for example, anomaly detection and things like that. So when some of the underlying technology maybe goes wrong and you're not able to see that, then you can alert even earlier than you would have been able to do. So the technology to enable you to see what's happening, see that something's going wrong well before you may have known a few years back is also a critical element of this.
Okay, thanks, Guy. Thanks for the answer. And maybe I'll move on to the next Q&A by Francois. I think this one, okay, Harwinder, maybe I'll ask you to answer this one. So the question is around how does DataOps and automation deal with enterprise data access control? So, with all the regulations around GDPR, PII, PDPA, does DataOps actually help or hinder from a compliance perspective?
Ron, I probably will pass on the question to maybe to David, I think.
Sure. I was actually, in fact, a little bit stumped in terms of what a hinder from a compliance perspective. I'm almost a bit tempted to ask, why would it? So, okay, perhaps not being too on that perspective. I very much I don't think so. In fact, if anything, I think it would help from a compliance point of view. It would help from a compliance point of view, and it would help from a governance perspective. So actually, on both from both points of view, which, as we all know, we all still have existing little devils to deal with when it comes to data and data governance. But it's really important because if you think about fundamentally what DataOps is really the modularization and the parcelization of steps such that they could rapidly adjust to situations and repeat themselves, rather than a situation of doing in a much larger SDLC, bigger type of approach. So that's why, and just a bit of the rationale as to why I'm saying I actually don't think it should hinder. I think it should support, because as and when potential issues are identified, they can be identified much earlier on and get potentially, rectified much earlier on. That would be my thinking. But again, perhaps the connotation of the question, perhaps something underlying behind it. I hope I answered it, Harinder.
Yeah, thanks, David. I think they are related topics, but I think they need to be tackled separately. I think if you take access and data access control, that governance that David talked about, around sensitive data, etc., who can access what, I think that's probably the first step. Regardless of whether you have DataOps and automation in the pipeline, right? So I think that's the foundation that the organization needs to get right, first of all. Because if you don't get that right, DataOps is not going to solve your data governance problems, okay? So let's put it that way. So with the right foundation around data governance, access control, etc., and you've got your regulations, your tagging against all these other PDPA, GDPR, etc., I think once you get that right, DataOps will help you. I don't think it will hinder you, because if once you know what you need to govern and how to govern that, DataOps will use that as part of the automation and the pipeline to make sure that it's in compliance with whatever data governance rules that you have, right? So again, related, but not one of them is going to solve the other one's problem either. So hopefully that would help you, Francois, to understand a bit better around the two topics. Okay, with that in mind, let me just mark this one as answered. Well, hopefully we did answer you, at least at a high level anyway. Okay, so next one, I wanna bring up one from Joyce. So Joyce, you talked about new technologies are being introduced and adopted. You're right, there's a lot on the market, a lot of startups, a lot of fintechs, etc. How do we guarantee production is ready for the change? And how do we make sure the business outcome is delivered on time every time? I think guaranteed is probably a strong word. I don't think any team or anyone likes to guarantee the business anything. But having said that, maybe Juan, maybe I'll call you out a bit. So to try and answer that and share your perspective for Joyce.
Yeah. Sure, no worries. I think I'm happy to answer this question. Yeah, why? Let me share a bit of strategic context of the smart city. For smart city, we are simple. We leverage innovation technology to solve city problem, right? And for data, we are not only building dashboard reports and so on. We realize that we need to build so-called more digital services for our citizens. So just FYI, in Jakarta now we build our so-called super apps. The name is Jakarta Kini, which is in English current or now Jakarta, whereby we will consolidate, let's say 200, 300 critical services from the government agencies into this single super apps or platform. That's the idea. So related to the question, I think it's highly important to test and validate the idea. It can be about, yeah, sure. I think there's a note as well about the DataOps. I will touch on that later. So I think there's a really needs here how we can ensure there is a good experimentation, there's a good test whether these features, these services will be useful, whether it can meet, let's say, the business target, the business needs, and there is a robust in terms of the mechanism or the system, right? So in this context, DataOps is highly critical for sure to automate or to ensure there is certain good cadence and so-called certain consistency in doing this, and especially when we integrate the new services. I think let's say we collaborate with several technology partners, not only in the global scale, but also the local startup in Jakarta, because we want to groom our ecosystem. So we want to ensure that we can involve this in our existing DevOps process. Sometimes it's not that easy. We need to really understand how to put this in the end-to-end process or pipeline. And again, once we have get that correct, and I think the result will be good. And I think there is no critical concern in terms of the final business outcome. So I think that's a really good case study in the way we build our digital product in our super apps in Smart City. But again, we're not perfect. For sure, we need to learn. We want to engage and more services. We want to engage with more players. And I think in terms of the complexity of the process of DevOps and so on, I think it will be increasing in the future. And for sure, there will be ups and downs. But for sure, we want to learn from this journey. I think that's my comment. Please feel free if anyone wants to add in and correct me. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, John. And Guy, maybe I'll ask you to share your opinion as well, coming from a fintech background. Obviously, you're more than have that experience rolling out software to your clients as well. You know, how do they incorporate that into, you know, the overall architecture? Again, guarantee maybe a strong word, but how do we ensure, you know, business outcomes are being met with different technology and products out there?
Yeah, so let me take the first part around rolling out to production. So in my view, this comes back to the sort of heading of automation. You know, this is really where DevOps started, and it's where DataOps continues, which is really automating a process that once was very manual. You know, there was a point where you might have needed to open a ticket with somebody in order to get something into production. That somebody would look at what you're doing. There'd be lots of human checks along the way, but of course, we're very fallible. And so I think the idea really is, if you want to change something that's happening in production, change a component of the tool set, if you're using new data sets in production, the question really is how you automate that to the greatest extent possible. You know, this is really fundamental DevOps coming into the data space, really. So the more automation you have, the better. Can you automate the deployment of that? Can you automate the testing of that? The more of that you have, the less likely it becomes that you're going to have issues when you come to production. I think that's really the crux of it, really about the automation. And again, that's fundamental to DevOps and it's fundamental to DataOps. On the question of guaranteed results, I mentioned SLAs before. As you say, there are no guarantees, but you need to have the right tool set in place for monitoring what's going on. If you can monitor what's going on, if you know both time-wise how long each step should take, and you can monitor that, and you know there are no errors in the steps, then you're already in a good place. And as I said, we're already looking at some advanced techniques to try and really predict failures in pipelines even before they happen, by trying to do things like anomaly detection, you know, just trying to look statistically at things that look anomalous. We can already begin to try and work out what's going wrong before it goes wrong. So there's a lot of new technology we can bring to bear as well on the monitoring of those pipelines.
Okay, great. Thanks, Guy, and keep the Q&A coming for the audience members. You know, we've still got about 13 minutes left, so happy to hear and answer more questions that you do have on, you know, on DataOps or, you know, any of these automation data topics. So happy to answer that. So in the meantime, I am going to start another poll, which would be our last poll for the day. So what kind of tools are you currently using for the orchestration? Right, anything enterprise workflow solution such as, you know, BMC's Control M, open source, cloud provision orchestration, maybe a bit more difficult from multi-cloud perspective, and, you know, that orchestration I think Guy talked about as well. So yeah, what is everyone using from an audience perspective? And Guy, maybe I will call you out again on this one, because I think you semi-answered some of this and shared your view. But from your perspective, obviously maybe a bit biased towards, you know, Control M. But obviously from your perspective, you know, obviously what should be some of the factors different organizations or different companies should consider when they try and choose the right orchestration tool for them?
Yeah. So as I said earlier, there are some cases where it's obvious. Well, I wouldn't even tell you to use Control M. If you have a small pipeline and you're using a single cloud provider and your data set's fairly simple, you know, you don't need something too large. But the experience of many of our customers is really all about what happens when you need to scale and productionalize what's happening. And I think that's really the crux of it. Once you go to production and you find yourself in a much more complex situation than you had when you started testing these workflows way back when, your data sets have suddenly grown in complexity. The change in the underlying data becomes more rapid. The number of sources becomes larger. Those could be external sources and they could be internal sources. At that point, you need to be thinking about, okay, what does my automation orchestration for these kind of things look like? I think that's the really important point here. There are plenty of tools and they all do a good job. But when things become complicated, when things really become mission critical and time critical, do I have the tool that enables me to, as we've said earlier, monitor those SLAs? Do I have the tool that allows me very easily to grab data from all of the different sources I need? Do I have a tool that allows me to manage this across potentially multiple cloud providers? Do I have a tool that allows me to manage the ingestion of data from multiple internal sources? You know, we have customers whose internal setup, even before we get to multi-cloud, is really, really complex. They have multiple internal applications. They all have very different data sources. They range from, I'll go back to mainframes, through to multiple ERP systems because they've grown through acquisition and they have 3 different ERP systems, through to a number of in-house applications they've written themselves, some of which sit internally, some of which sit on AWS, and some sit on Azure, and some on GCP. And all of these things need to be brought in to a single point several times a day in order to run the data process itself. So I think that's the key thing. You need to think not about what do I need to do today, but what do I want to be? Where will I be in 6 months' time, a year's time? Is my orchestration system going to be able to cope? You know, if you start today with a bit of cron and a few open source solutions, it could work brilliantly. Is that scalable, and is it going to work in a year's time when I've added all these additional sources and my world is suddenly changing more quickly? That's what you need to think about.
Okay, thanks, Guy. And Joanne, maybe you have a different point of view as well from an end user perspective.
Very brief comment, and especially about the latest poll, about the orchestration. I think in Digital Smart City, we are very biased towards Airflow, so we have been using that. But my point is not just about the tools, but about the process and the administration. Because in government, we are a bit different from the industry. We have our very rigid, let's say, annual procurement process, and it's a bit it's very painful to us, to be open. So for sure, we have planned for the entire year. At the same time, I want to keep exploring and testing new tools, new processes, and so on. How we can do this? I think for sure the first answer is about the open source tools, free, and also about the one that we can try, experiment, and so on. I think that's the mindset in the government context. But yeah, that's the tool that we have been using so far in Digital Smart City. Thanks.
Okay, great. Thanks, Joanne, for sharing. Moving back to the Q&A, I think this is the last one that we're seeing here for now, another one from Francois. David, if I can call you out on this one to share your views. Any opinions around how DataOps will relate or maybe doesn't relate to other architectural frameworks such as, data mesh or event-driven architecture?
Sorry, there was a lag. Can you just repeat the first part of the questions? My apologies. Roland, can you hear me?
Yeah, sorry, David, can you hear us?
No, I said there was.
Your line is a bit choppy.
Oh dear. Yeah, so I couldn't actually hear the first part of the question. David? I can hear you now.
Kind of. Okay, I think we're good. Okay, so David, so the question from the audience was around how or do you think DataOps is related to other frameworks such as data mesh or event-driven architecture?
Oh, well, if you think about it, ultimately, the underlying reliance essentially is from a combination of frameworks and tools. Now, I'm always a bit cautious of going into too much detail with respect to the specificities of how to implement it, because what you do also find is that it has to accommodate and has to be contextualized to the underlying organizations. For example, whether you're still in an on-premise environment, whether it's a hybrid, whether you're fully moved to cloud, and so forth effectively. So as to whether it's relatedness and relevance, absolutely. But again, it depends. My kind of strong recommendation would be to effectively start up from the underlying framework, then essentially doing from a gap analysis with respect to what is available and the potential necessities, tools, or capabilities in order to achieve that effectively. I think that's a really important element. If you think about ultimately going back to some of the principle of data ops, it's effectively, and if I quote my mother, it's not to boil the ocean to make a cup of tea. I mean, that's the predicate and principle around it, is the ability to make small mistakes and correct from them as fast as possible, essentially. That would be my kind of really anchored and strong recommendations and kind of response to how to think about it with respect to various other approaches and facilities, essentially.
Yeah, thanks, David, and I agree, and Francois, and I think what there's a lot of frameworks out there. There's a lot of different processes and frameworks and methodologies, etc. And I think, whether they're related or not is probably not necessarily the question that maybe you should be asking, your internal side as well. It's like, what are we using it for? What's the outcome that we're trying to drive? What's the value of doing a certain thing? And then maybe from there is, how do we drive the right methodology to achieve that outcome? So you would probably find, again, in the large organizations, there will be a lot of overlaps, I would say, or competing priorities and policies and frameworks that would obviously then start to overlap, right? It goes back to R&R and TOMS, etc. So, that would be another fundamental problem. That would be, I would recommend probably looking at that first before we actually say, okay, now what do all these overlaps actually mean? So with that in mind, I don't see any more Q&A. So I think, we've got 4 minutes left. So maybe I'll probably ask each of the panelists to probably share a bit of closing remarks, around obviously our topic around data ops and automation. So just share, for the past, almost hour, in a quick summary, maybe in 2 sentences, just summarize what your views are on data ops. So Guy, maybe if I can start with you.
Sure. I think I'll summarize by just saying, if you do have a DataOps project, start with the end in mind. The end is going to be production. Around production, you need compliance, governance, reproducibility. That requires good orchestration. So remember where you're trying to get to. Don't think about test and training where you start, but think about production at the end and everything that you're going to need in order to make sure that your production workflows run reliably, repeatably, and on time.
Thanks, Guy. Juan, we'll call you out next.
Okay, sure. Simple tips for me. So ensure you put DataOps in the context of your entire architecture ecosystem, and ensure you're aware about your organization objective. And I believe there will be good implication and benefits from it. Thanks.
Thank you. Harwinder?
I think I'm going to echo what Guy said, right? Start with the end in mind, because sometimes some of these initiatives are very, very overwhelming to start off with. And I think if we are able to clearly quantify what is it that we want to get to, I think that journey becomes very, very easy, I think, in that way. And I think, again, coming from a banking environment, I think getting that right alignment on sponsorship for some of these programs becomes very, very critical, because if you're trying to do it at a small scale, or maybe not able to articulate really the tangible outcome, sometimes you don't really get that priority that you really want to, if you want to get things done faster. So I think I'd probably, comment on these couple of things.
Thanks, Harwinder. David, any tips or last comments from you?
I actually want to perhaps echo and end also with Guy's comments, is really, really start with the end in sight. And start the end in sight, don't boil the ocean. And I think it's extremely important, to simply get going. A lot of times I've seen that we're spending an exceeding amount of time, planning, thinking, conceptualizing, strategizing, but not actually doing. The reality is that there will always be challenges with data. There will always be little hiccups along the way, but essentially is having that goal and that objective and having the end in sight. Again, just as Guy was mentioning.
Great, thanks, David. And again, and I do echo all four panelists' views. Just do it. Just try it. Right. What's the worst that could happen? You've heard from the four panelists now. Clients are using it. Companies are using DataOps. They are using automation. They are seeing value out of it. So what is stopping, the audience members for actually just trying it out? What's the worst that could happen? So with that, I am going to close on the hour. Thank you very much to our four panelists for sharing their views and taking the time to answer all the questions. And hopefully, me passing questions around. I had the easy job today of just passing it around. So again, appreciate all the help. And the time, and to the participants, hopefully this was valuable to all of you, and hopefully we'll meet again soon, whether in person or virtually. And thank you all, and have a great day ahead.